Causes of the Great Depression, sort of, kind of. This one should be a little bit quicker of a lesson. I know I say that all the time, and I'm really, really going to try to make this one a little bit quicker. Certainly won't be 40 minutes like the last one. But I just want to highlight what some of the major causes of the Depression are, and fits really nicely into where we're at right here. So I'll move as quickly as I possibly can, and then you can move on from there. There are a couple things you got to know first off. Number one, and this is a big misconception, the stock market crash did not single-handedly cause the Great Depression. It was kind of more like a tipping point that set several factors in motion. So all of the assumptions that people make that the stock market crash then caused it's kind of like the last sort of piece to fall into place, but it is not the reason that it happened. No one factor alone really could say could cause the Great Depression. There's a lot of things that influence what happens here and makes it as bad as it is, and none of these things alone actually really impact it by themselves. Also important to understand is that big business cycles are a thing, and there are big ups and big downs in the economy all of the time. Business cycles are part of the economic flow that we go through. It goes up, and it can only go so far up, and then it has to come back down. And people that know about economics understand this and do not freak out when the economy starts to go down, and do not worry like when the coronavirus hits and sell off all their stocks and do all this. That's not what people that understand how economies work do, because business cycles happen all the time for lots of different reasons. It goes up and down, and that's just part of it. And because of that the Great Depression obviously ends up worse because people don't understand that. And then lastly, if to understand what causes the Great Depression, you have to have done well reading last chapter, because the 1920s explain the whole thing. Most of the causes of the Great Depression are indiscretions of the 1920s or missteps that were made along there. So understanding the 1920s is understanding what happens in the 1930s during the Great Depression. So now that you know those really important things, we can get on to what the actual causes of the Great Depression may be. Number one, buying on credit in the 1920s. It's important to understand that buying on credit is like installment loans. It's not using a credit card. When you use a credit card, there's a bank in the middle, and the bank pays that basically pays for your item, and then you owe then the bank. So the bank kind of steps in as a middleman. The problem with buying on credit in the 1920s is that it wasn't like that. Installment loans weren't like that. Most of the creditors were actually the business owners. So you go in and you buy a piece of furniture, you'd be like, hey, yeah, I want to buy this, but I can't afford it all right now. It's like, sure, you can have this couch for $500, but you can pay $50 a month for the next 10 months, and then you can have it. But that's all on the business owner. The business owner is basically giving you that couch. You're walking out of that door, maybe paying $50 that day, and that business owner is hoping to high heaven that you're going to pay $50 next month too. And if you can't pay, and if you default on your loan, then it's the business owner that's assumed all that debt, and that's going to be in trouble if you don't pay it back. Not a middleman and an investment professional like a bank. Okay, so when businesses, small mom and pop businesses, issue all of these things out on credit and do all this credit, and keep in mind the people that they're selling these couches to and furniture to, or whatever, the refrigerators to, these are people that live in their town, that they know, that they're around every single day, and so they have a really hard time sometimes making people pay up because they're their friends or they're people that they know, or things like that. Even if you do want to try to force somebody's hand, when there's no money and people can't pay their debts, there's no money. And you can take them to court, you can sue them, you can do it. But if they don't have any money, you're not going to get any money. And so with the business owners assuming that debt, when it comes to time for those people to pay and they can't pay, those businesses are the ones that suffer. Because they got a business, they issued that credit, and now people aren't paying them. They're the ones in trouble, and that causes business failure. So buying on credit does that. And secondly, it creates this false sense of prosperity. People have all this crap, but they can't pay for it. And so that's kind of the consequence. Couldn't resist the irony of this wonderful ad from the 1920s for the new Corona. It's a typewriter. So you can buy it on credit. Installment plan, $22.50. Places it in your hands, and the balance in easy payments. So buying on credit is number one. Number two is the overproduction of goods. Everybody's buying stuff, right? So we got to make more. And mass production becomes more and more effective all of the time and more efficient. We know Model Ts are pumping off the line like once every 20 seconds. Well, eventually, people don't want to buy any more cars or can't buy any more cars. And so you need to find somebody to buy this stuff, but there's nobody to buy stuff. We tried to sell it to other countries. That's what imperialism was partially about before. Remember, we going off and creating new markets for our goods. Well, the 1920s has brought some sort of isolationism. And even though dollar diplomacy tries to market our goods to other countries, people in Nicaragua aren't buying Model Ts. They're not buying refrigerators. And so you've made all this stuff, but they just have backstock and overproduction of all of these goods that they've produced and nobody to buy them. And that's what this great industrial capitalism of the 1920s has produced, is this massive industrial machine, but no buyers, and people that have limited purchasing power, and that are already in debt for everything that they've already bought. And so you've got goods on the shelf, and any producer can tell you, the more goods you have on the shelf, the worse that can end up being for you. If nobody's buying, there's a demand problem. Reason number three is outrageous and ridiculous tariffs. I know tariffs aren't the most exciting thing to talk about in history, but this one is really significant. It's called the Hawley Smoot tariff, and it is the highest tariff ever in history. And what that means is that other countries are going to do the same to us. This is called trade wars. They're going to raise their tariffs. It's going to be more expensive to buy their goods, and they're going to buy less of our goods. And so this kind of exacerbates that problem that we just discussed. People aren't buying our stuff because we've raised our tariffs and they've raised their tariffs, and there's just not as much international commerce going on with the United States because of this outrageous tariff. And that produces less markets and kind of brings the economy a little bit to a halt, at least in the international phase of it. So the Hawley Smoot tariff does not help that one bit. Fourth, you have the unequal distribution of wealth. You've got a lot of money concentrated in the hands of a few rich people, and you've got very little money in the poor. But what's happened here is because of that, this big gap is being created between the rich and the poor. Again, just kind of like it was a little bit during the Gilded Age. And this shrinking middle class is a problem because those are the people that buy stuff. The middle of the class is the one that makes purchases. And without them making those consumer purchases, then money doesn't go back into the economy, doesn't stimulate the economy. You might say, well, rich people, they have lots of money. Obviously, they buy lots of stuff. They spend lots of money. They invest lots of money, and that's true. But think of it this way. If you give $1 million to one person, how many cars are they going to buy? Probably a couple, right? Or a few, several, 3 or 4. Maybe some people might buy 5 or 6, whatever. Okay? But if you give $1 million to 50 people, how many cars are going to be bought then? 40, 50, maybe all of them buy cars. See what I mean? So $1 million in the hands of one person doesn't buy as many consumer goods as $1 million does in the hands of 50 people. It just doesn't work that way. And so the middle class, without wealth concentrated in some kind of middle class, there's not as much consumer spending. Less consumer spending means less items being bought, means overproduction, means failing businesses and all those kinds of things. There's just way too much money tied up at the top, and money at the top doesn't flow. Also, wealthy people don't often put money back into the economy as much as they save a lot of money. Sometimes they will invest, but it's not money flowing through the economy. And of course, the poor are able to spend very little because they have very little. And so this unequal distribution of wealth and this huge gap between the rich and the poor also makes a worse economic situation. Also, you have a failing farm industry, again, as always, right? So agriculture was booming during World War I, and then the war ends. And just like any other time in American history, when there's no war, it's not a great time to be a farmer. And so they end up with the same problems as always. Overproduction, they try to produce more, they have the debt on the farms, and it's just almost impossible to make money. Pair this with the fact that the 1920s is a industrial capitalist economy. It's focused on big business. Calvin Coolidge said the factory is the temple. The man that works there worships there. It's an emphasis on those kinds of things, and the government isn't really protecting farming at all. There's not a lot of populism that's spreading around. And so to make matters worse, of course, then you have the Dust Bowl, this environmental tragedy, partly brought on from poor farming techniques, but this environmental tragedy that feeds into that and makes it even worse and even more impossible for farmers to make a living uh, off of agriculture. So that takes out a whole sector of the economy as well with farming. Now, finally, we can get to the stock market. Because with all of those other factors that are developing throughout the 1920s, things are looking bad. But certain factors have masked that. Buying on credit makes things look like there's prosperity, that things are going well. Um, and so the stock market is another thing. The stock market is booming, and so it makes people make it look like things are going really well. But that was false image and false prosperity as well. People are doing a couple things on the stock market that are not good, or generally considered to be bad habits. One of them is called speculation. People do it a lot today. It's still a bad habit. It doesn't make it right just because they advertise it on TV. Speculation is the quick or rapid buying and selling of stocks in order to try to make a quick buck. It's called day trading. Sometimes you hear that a lot. TD Ameritrade and all these companies you see online that you can get or you see the commercials. You can get these programs on your desktop, and you can follow and buy, sell stocks every day. It's like a game, and that's exactly what it is. It's a game. It's gambling. When you buy and sell stocks quickly and speculate like that on a daily basis, that's not a really stable way to make money on the stock market. It's like gambling. It's like a game. Okay. And because when people do that, that makes the market very, very unstable. Because when something happens, like the coronavirus hits, people that speculate and are buying selling quickly, as soon as they see they're starting to take a loss, they pull money out. Well, if there's a lot of speculation happening on the market and a lot of people pull money out at the same time, that's really bad. So just generally, speculation is a pretty poor market practice. And by the way, it's not a really good way to play the market generally anyway. The stock market is best invested in over time, because the market, as we talked about through business cycles, generally goes up and down, and that'll happen, but it trends up over time. The other big problem that people are having on the stock market, that we're having with the stock market, is people doing what we call buying on margin. Because the stock market is doing so well, everybody wants to get involved, but not everybody can afford to get involved. So people do the same thing in the stock market as they were doing with consumer goods as well. If you can't afford it, you borrow money. And so people begin buying stock on margin. In other words, they're borrowing money or taking out loans to buy stock. And the expectation is that eventually your stock is just going to shoot through the roof anyway, so you'll be able to pay off that debt plus get all the extra money that you're making from your investment, and everything's going to be fine and dandy. But just like debt on consumer debt is bad, especially if the economy changes or your situation changes, you can't pay it off. Obviously, buying on margin is bad. Think of it as like taking out a loan to go to Choctaw. It doesn't make any sense. You're gambling with borrowed money, and that's a bad idea. And you can see kind of where that's going once the crash hits. So because of the natural state of things, the market begins to stutter a little bit in 28. That's not that shocking or surprising, given all the other things that are happening in the economy at this time. There's less disposable income. People are investing less because the economy is probably going to hit a little bit of a downswing. And so it stutters a little bit in 28, and several times throughout 1929, all the signs saying that the economy was about to be in a downturn were there. And it takes several big hits throughout September and October that year. But of course, what everybody remembers is Black Tuesday, October 27th, 1929, when it takes a huge hit, and October 29th of 1929. It takes that huge hit and then just plummets, and people begin to sell. And it wasn't the first time that year that something like that had happened, but it was definitely the most damaging. And you've got millions of shares dumped that day, 16 million some shares that are dropped that day, and millions more without buyers by the end of the day, which is obviously a really bad situation. Stock prices plummet, and people panic. And the stock market does kind of get bailed out a little bit over the next week or so by some investors, and starts to steady a little bit, but gradually over the next couple months, people just completely jump out of the market. Part of it's because of speculation, part of it's because of buying on margin, part of it's because the market was going to go anyway, and those things just make it that much worse. And then people make things worse, as they normally do, and they panic. And when they panic and when they pull their money out of the stock market, that's really what makes a bad situation even worse. And so what probably could have been just a regular, typical kind of downturn in the stock market, which is okay, and that can happen, it becomes disastrous. And one of the big fallouts of this is bank closures. And a problem here because they let out those loans, those margin loans, to people, and now people can't pay back those margin loans. The banks lose. And this is especially a big problem because all of these margin loans that they've made, the banks closed their doors. Now, you might not have invested in the stock market, but your bank closes its doors because a lot of other people that banked there did, and they've lost all their money, and now you just had your really secure personal savings there, but now that bank has closed because it made risky investments with other people, and now it's shot and it's done, and it closes its doors. And in 1929, if the your bank closes its doors and it's done, then you don't get your money, and there's no place you can go to get that money. You just pretty much lose out. So that kind of takes all of these things and becomes sort of that final straw and that last event that sort of tips things. That's 1929. By about the kind of the peak of the Depression hits about 1932 or 1933, where about a third or somewhere between a third and a half of the banks in the country had closed their doors. So these are the factors that really affect what happens with the Great Depression and make it what it is. And of course, all of these things snowball, and then it leads to unemployment. It leads to all these things, and that it just kind of continues on from there. And so I should have put another slide here that puts all of these on 1 through 6. But these are the factors that then contribute to that. Again, one thing in particular does not necessarily make this happen, but altogether put the economy in a bad position. And then, to be honest, what really causes the Great Depression is stupid people, and because of the way that we react to it. It's the way that people have been playing the stock market and then panic on the stock market. It's some of the moronic practices of the farmers that they've done throughout time. It's some of the stupid buying on credit that took place in the 1920s and buying stuff that you can't afford. It's a lot of really bad decisions by people that kind of make this worse than it actually should be. And when it hits, and you'll see this you've seen this as you do your reading, Herbert Hoover's response may have been a little bit inadequate, and the government's response doesn't really work very effectively at that point either. So a lot of bad decisions and a lot of people that had opportunities maybe to not make this as bad as it was, but yet it does. So those are the causes. There's a lot more in this chapter. There's a lot more to look at. Hoover's response and why that doesn't work. Life during the Depression, what that looks like. What are some of these real effects? And that's why I've put that on the slide there. Consider what some of those real effects are. You can't just say in an essay, oh, people lost jobs. You have to have something a little bit more rich to say there. So make sure you examine those effects. And then, of course, the intervention with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and what he does in his first 100 days, what those first New Deal programs and those alphabet soup agencies look like, and why that works or doesn't work, or why it's effective or isn't effective, and what impact it does make. And then, of course, the second New Deal. So look at those things as you're studying, as you're going through the reading and understanding what's going on. But those are the major causes of the Great Depression.